Welcome to the Arena Decklist podcast. I'm Gary Thompson, joined by Brian Gottlieb, and I like these kind of episodes, Brian. We're about to go super deep on Historic's best deck.
I'm excited for this episode. It's rare that we can do them because I think one of the core tenets of an episode like this is that we have to agree. We have to see things the same way, and we have to be excited about the same deck because we both have to have our reps in with it. We have to line up in our goals for the deck and what we're trying to accomplish. And we got there. We ended up basically exactly on the same page this week. And I was anxious to pick your brain about this because this is mostly your deck. I'm going to hand the credit over to you. We'll get into all of this, but I had some concerns with an existing deck. I was already gestating a way to address them in my mind. And then you messaged me out of the blue with this deck list. And I'm like, oh yeah, you've solved all the problems I have. Let's go. And deck has been great for me.
Well, like most of the decks that I quote unquote build, it is basically just taking inspiration from a lot of different areas.
Mm-hmm, of course.
And over the last few weeks, basically since Kaladesh was on the verge of coming out in Historic, that's basically what I've been focused on. And I've also just been like really happy and really interested in Magic. So that's been cool. And there were a lot of cards that I wanted to play with again because I knew that they would be great, like Scrapheap Scrounger and things like that. And was working on some Rakdos vehicles type of stuff. That didn't really work out. And then Nick Prince sent me his list and we iterated on that. And like he was coming at it from a different angle than I was, which helped, just get like another head in the mix. And he solved a lot of the problems that I had. And then together we solved some more of the problems. And then Star City, like their, Kaldheim championship qualifier stuff started happening. So we got a lot of Historic deck lists and a lot of people were playing Rakdos Sacrifice. So I looked at all of those deck lists and watched some of the tournament too and liked a lot of what was going on. It was basically just like Scrapheap Scrounger in that deck, but then there were also some random Stitcher suppliers, and granted, those fine. Cauldron Familiar, Woe Strider, some Croxas. It's a reasonable card to sacrifice to Priest of Forgotten Gods and stuff like that. But Bomat Courier was one of the cards that I looked at for that sort of archetype. And I'm just like, there's no way that this card isn't just incredible in this deck. And so I kind of just like put all of that together, tuned it a little bit, and here we are.
The first game I played with Bomat Courier in this list, it soloed my Azorius Control opponent. I don't mean like it was the only thing that mattered, but it was. But it also did something like 17 points of damage across the multiple Bomat Couriers I played in the game. It was just, I'll play a Bomat Courier, I'll sit on it, I'll leave mana open all the time, make you do something, and if you choose to do something, I'll punish the shit out of you, but you can't do anything because you know that, so I'll just sit here and run this Bomat Courier at you till the end of time, and at some point I'll draw 9 new cards, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, I didn't have like a draw 9 experience against them, but I've definitely played matches against one specifically I remember was against Azorius with like main deck Grafdigger's Cage and stuff like that. But even Dimir and Sultai sometimes where you just out card advantage them unless they get to stick to Fairy or like maybe Narset and kind of chain those together. Like you just draw way more cards than they do, and despite them having a cage, I'm just like able to grind them out pretty easily.
That was my experience as well. Why don't we start with the deck list before we get into too much of the specifics here and tell people exactly what you're playing with?
Let's do it. All right. So top to bottom, 4 Cauldron Familiar, 4 Bomat Courier, 4 Priest of the Forgotten Gods, 4 Scrapheap Scrounger, 3 Woe Strider, 3 Midnight Reaper, 4 Mayhem Devil, 4 Claim the Firstborn, 4 Witch's Oven, 2 Thoughtseize, 24 lands total, 4 Blood Crypt, 3 Dragonskull Summit, a Phyrexian Tower, 2 Castle Locthwain, 4 Fabled Passage, 4 Mountain, 6 Swamp. And the sideboard is 2 Abrade, 1 Bedevil, 3 Noxious Grasp, 2 Chandra Torch of Defiance, 2 Soul Guide Lantern, 3 Witch's Vengeance, 2 Thoughtseize.
Okay. That out of the way. Where do we want to start our discussion? I think maybe just moving through these card by card is the best way to go about it, because it also will talk about the changes you've made as we do that. And there's some numbers here that have gone down from the stock list. There's some numbers that have gone up, and there's some cards that are just missing from this list. And I agree with every conclusion you've reached in this main deck. So it says something when we're on the exact same page, but I love the way this deck is shaping up now, and right down to what cards you're trimming and what cards you're excluding altogether. It all makes sense to me.
Yeah, Stitcher Supplier I think is fine. I think that's one of the big cards that's missing right now. And it does a lot of small things, but it ultimately plays into a lot of the sideboard hate or main deck hate in some cases that people will throw at you, whereas Bomat Courier does the exact opposite. So Bomat Courier, outside of like Yasharn, is going to help you be a little bit more robust against things like Grafdigger's Cage, Leyline of the Void, and it's still a cheap card to sacrifice. You're not getting value up from it like you would from Stitcher Supplier, but Stitcher Supplier is still hit or miss. It's not like a guarantee that it's even going to be better than Bomat Courier, outside of like giving you some cards to use for escape. So I don't think you're missing out on much by getting rid of Stitcher Supplier. It might be different if you're like trying to play Kroxa for some reason, which I don't know. I'm not a super big fan of in this deck, because you try to develop your board a little bit and then sacrifice some stuff, get some value, and then redevelop, and Kroxa just takes like a long time to come on. I think Bomat Courier has been excellent. I started with like 2 Stitcher Supplier and 3 Bomats, and then was just like, this is nonsense. Just play all the Bomats, cut the Stitchers. And Bomat helps fix the mana too, which is a consideration, because before you would have things like, Thoughtseize, Cauldron Familiar, Stitcher Supplier, where you would just need like all of your lands to make black, which is not really possible. And so you just end up with these turns where you couldn't play like 2 or 3 spells. And Bomat being another colorless card means that you get to use your mana basically on every turn.
It's made a big difference to how the games play out. And it sounds like a small thing, but it's a big thing. And especially like, it's not only Bomat Courier doing this trick, it's Scrapheap Scrounger. And the consistency of just whatever your mana is, you can jam out these cards and it will be fine, changes the way you can build your entire curve. And it just makes it more certain that you're going to be participating in the early game, which I think is the change that this deck has made. If you're going to get the addition of Scrapheap Scrounger doesn't live solely off of its ability to return to the battlefield. Like, that's nice, but this deck has a lot of resiliency, and you could build it with more resiliency if you wanted to. And there's various versions of strategies like this that can just be loaded with resiliency. You can play out of your graveyard almost exclusively. And I think like the Kroxa Stitcher Supplier stuff does that. Like typical Rakdos Arcanist list, you'll play out of your graveyard very happily. And one of the reasons you can't favor that strategy right now over something like Rakdos Sacrifice is that it is so linear and it is trying to just play out of the graveyard. But when you add Bomat Courier, Scrapheap Scrounger to this deck, it picks up a whole nother dimension. And that dimension is aggression. Those early points of damage that Bomat Courier plus Scrapheap Scrounger are getting in, you leverage them and you just burn people out with Priest of Forgotten Gods, Mayhem Devil, because they took 5 in the early game, and it's very manageable. You don't have to set up overwhelming board states anymore. You have the reach to effectively kill people, and I think that also speaks to the removal of Stitcher Supplier. Stitcher Supplier is about accumulating resources and getting to the place where you can return to Scrapheap Scroungers and get really wide and still have more Woe Striders ready to go, and it just doesn't fit with how I'm playing this deck now. And if that's what I wanted to accomplish, I would go back to Rakdos Arcanist, because I think that deck does that game plan better than this deck. But this deck has the aggression, and that aggression has mattered against a bunch of opponents.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that too, especially when you take into consideration how often you're going to have to fight against piles of removal or graveyard hate, things that slow you down and basically make it so that you can't, have Cauldron Familiar and Oven and Priest and Mayhem Devil like all on the battlefield at the same time, right? Like you're going to be playing a lot of low econ games, and Bomat Scrapheap Scrounger love that.
Yeah, this is a main deck Grafdigger's Cage format. And if you ignore that, you'll be punished for it. You have to build your deck with that in mind if you want to have an edge on a given week. And I think you're doing that here. Now, that's not to say that the Rakdos Sacrifice decks, as previously built, weren't a great choice for week 1. I think they were. I think it was a really, really good call. And adding Scrapheap Scrounger to the deck, even without this new level of refinement that I think you've added is a really, really nice move, and the power is there. But as the deck draws the attention of the metagame, you have to have some shifts available. And you're pre-shifted here because I don't think you've given anything up by building your deck in this fashion. I think you're able to do all of the game plans that the older Rakdos Sacrifice lists had access to. The only thing you're slowing down a little bit on is the recursive nature of the Woe Strider Scrapheap Scrounger out of the graveyard. But I always had a Scrapheap Scrounger when I needed one. Like, it really wasn't a problem for me.
Yeah, I've had the same thing, and playing certainly like the Rakdos Arcanist deck and older versions of Rakdos Sacrifice, there are just so many games where you have like 4 things to do out of your graveyard, and obviously you can't do all of them, right? Because they all take up the resource of like cards in your graveyard. And this is built to just be like, well, I'm going to have like 1 or 2 things to choose from to be able to play out of my graveyard. And you use kind of like every part of the buffalo or whatever, right? Where your graveyard's going to be empty and you're going to have a Woe Strider, and that's fine. You don't need 20 cards in your graveyard and 4 different options to cast, because that's nonsense and doesn't do anything against actual graveyard hate. So you have some light recursion, just enough to keep pace with someone trying to, use spot removal spells to bury you or whatever, but you don't need a ton of it.
Yeah, it's played out that way in my experience as well. So I'm kind of jumping all around here. We're doing a poor job of the card by card thing. So why don't you get us back on track? We talked a little bit. Bomat Courier, do you have more to say about that card?
Not really. It's just really good. Like, there are definitely matchups, and it's usually like on the draw where you might want to side it out because they have blockers or incidental ways to kill it or whatever. But you did a lot of that with Citrus Supplier anyway. So I honestly, I don't think you're losing out on a ton by playing it instead of Stitcher Supplier, and the upside that you gain is so huge. And even if you're doing less recursive things, you still have Bomat as like a source of card advantage. So, you're less recursive, but you still are able to use like all of your mana basically for the entire game because you don't run out of resources.
Yep, that tracks.
Where else do you want to go?
So I said my piece on Scrapheap Scrounger as well. I kind of lumped that in with Bomat Courier. Anything else you want to add about that card?
No, basically what you said, where it actually just adds a clock. Like, it's a sacrificial thing that is recursive, but actually, does put them on a decent clock. And you do have a lot of chip shots with like Priest and Cauldron Familiar and Mayhem Devil. So having a way to actually, move the game a little bit towards getting them to 0, right? It's like, it's way easier to kind of Mayhem Devil fireball them out when they're at 10 versus 20, right? Yeah. So having something that can actually attack, and something that they're even discouraged from blocking, is kind of nice too. So Scrapheap kind of opens up that door for you too.
Huge Skyclave Shade fan. I still, to some extent, think it's an underappreciated card, but after playing with Scrapheap Scrounger again, I feel kind of bad that I ever said that Skyclave Shade was in its league, because it's not. Scrapheap Scrounger is just way better and so much easier to play with, and the timing windows are all better. Like, doing things at the end of your opponent's turn feels so good. You get so many more options, and they all matter for sure.
Yeah, I will say that I also love Skyclave Shade, and I felt similarly to you, where it's like, oh, this is mostly doing the same kind of thing. In a lot of instances it is. But yeah, just the being able to, even like not even necessarily bring it back, but like have the option to, while you're also sitting on some other sort of like instant speed thing or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe you hold open like a food activation and a Scrapheap Scrounger thing. And it changes the way that your opponent has to play. It gives you a bunch of options. It doesn't force you to commit to anything immediately. And obviously, it gives you a little bit of resiliency against sweepers. Like, even if they Wrath of God you or whatever, you still get to keep hammering them, which is nice. So Scrapheap Scrounger, I've missed you.
Totally agree. So let's go next to the other big thing that you addressed that I had a problem with in the original list. And when I talk about the original list, I'm pretty much talking about like Tristan Wild LaRue's list that finished second place at this weekend SCG event. And shout out to Tristan. Tristan's one of our Patreons to see him all the time in our Discord and has just been killing it lately. Qualified for the last, again, I don't know what anything is called. The last arena qualifier thingy. Already is going to play the PT soon and has been crushing high mythic. And this deck just showed Tristan has a really good sense of where the metagame's going. But again, nitpicking his deck, not trying to trash it because I think it was an awesome piece of deck building. But it felt a little flooded in the 3-drop slot to me. And like you said, there you get to a spot where you just have like too many options and you can't do all of them. And I felt that really hard on my 3 mana turns. I wanted more cheap spells in the deck. And you made subtle trims to the 3 mana slot from Tristan's list, per se. He had 4 Midnight Reaper, 4 Woe Strider. And I like that going into week 1. Like, it was just a super clean, super streamlined list. Made a lot of sense. But knowing how the games play out a little bit more, I like that you've dialed it back a bit. And now at 3 Midnight Reaper, 3 Woe Strider, talk about that decision a little bit.
I started with 2 Midnight Reaper, actually, but I don't know, like the decks like Sultai are the difficult matchups. So I felt like playing an extra Midnight Reaper was a good way to get extra percentage against them. And I think that Tristan did the same thing where it's like, oh, I'll just play 4 of this, right? And that'll help me. But Woe Strider is just one of those cards that it's good if, like Standard, for example, when people were dabbling with sacrifice stuff, they didn't play Oven because Cauldron Familiar is banned, so they had like Village Rites and Woe Strider as their sacrifice outlets. So it's like, okay, you play 4 Woe Strider, but this deck has Priest and Witch's Oven and Woe Strider, and you just don't need 4 copies of Woe Strider. And drawing the second one is very often redundant because of Escape. So it was just a card that I never wanted to draw multiples of, and it didn't make sense for me to play it as a 4 of.
Yeah, the worst games I played were just when I had multiple 3-drops clogging up my hand. You need to multi-spell with a deck like this. It's where a lot of your edge comes from. And you do want to spend all your mana every turn, but you want to accomplish multiple things with it. And just playing one thing is not where you want to be. Like, you're happy to have a Woe Strider on the battlefield, but you'd rather have a turn that is about, Thoughtseize, Priest of Forgotten Gods. And now into your next turn, you're threatening a snowball as opposed to here's my one thing, because you're lower power than the rest of the format. Like, your cards compared to something like Uro or Wrath of God or Teferi, they just don't really keep pace all that well. So you want to play multiples at every single juncture. And I think the glut of 3-drops was kind of fighting against that a little bit. And you can't get away from Mayhem Devil. That's your whole setup. So these are the ones that have to come down in numbers a little bit. I experimented for a while with playing even fewer Woe Striders, just because, like you said, if you draw one, you're mostly set. You want to have access to it for sure, but having multiples can be really clunky. However, I do think there's enough spots where you just like fireball your opponent out with a Woe Strider that 3 feels about in the sweet spot to me.
Yeah, the thing with that is with Scrapheap Scrounger, like I said, they're usually going to be at a lower life total, right?
Yep.
And I've found myself needing those setups where Woe Strider is like the only card in the deck that allows you to sacrifice everything.
Yep.
And the games usually don't get to that point anymore because you have additional ways of actually getting in chip shots. So normally, if it's like you have a Mayhem Devil and an Oven and a Fabled Passage and like a Bomat and a Priest or whatever, it's like you can find a way to cobble together a bunch of damage.
Sure. That's a fair point.
Yeah, I don't know. Woe Strider is just good enough, and I could see playing fewer copies. I could see going down to 2. I probably wouldn't go, lower than that. And I think I like 10 3s. That feels about right. I agree with you that sometimes you're in those clunky scenarios where it's like, maybe you don't even have a 2-drop, and then you have to spend like turn 3 and 4 only playing 3 drops, and you just fall behind on mana efficiency and stuff. So,
yep.
Maybe you're supposed to go down to 9 and play like another cheap spell, or I don't know. I looked at a lot of the 2-drops and I was not pretty pleased with them. And a lot of folks were just playing like Croxa in addition to Priest and Scrapheap. So I don't think there's really anything there. But
yeah, I also don't love Croxa here. But there is a cheap spell that you added to your main deck. And I think this is kind of the last point of differentiation between your list and what I would consider the stock list right now, and that's main deck Thoughtseize. 2 copies in the main deck. You could sell me on 3 very easily, because I think this is doing a lot of safety work for you. There's some holes in this deck, especially in game one. So I'll say that when I play with it, game one feels like a bit of a struggle, but I often feel like I'm upgrading in games 2 and 3, which is a weird position for this deck to be in, because you think like the graveyard deck should be able to be effectively hated out in games 2 and 3, but you really just clean up your plan so well, and you can tailor make your deck for what you're playing against. So your plan in game ones, though, revolves a lot around having a catch-all like Thoughtseize, and you could sell me on having more copies of this card for sure.
Yeah, it's funny because this is supposed to be like the theme deck, right? Like this is the deck that's supposed to lose to Grafdigger's Cage or whatever, and especially now it just doesn't. I think Cage is still probably worth bringing in or whatever, but I definitely would not hard mulligan for it or keep hands based on the strength of it or anything. And realistically, this is a deck that, for example, has trouble beating like, Sweeper into Teferi sometimes, or a Resolved Uro, or Yasharn for sure, but just like creatures that cost 4 mana. Maybe you're like a little weak to flyers. Like I've gotten beat by Shark Typhoon a couple times. So this is a deck that is more prone to like its weaknesses as a strategy and less to just something like Graveyard Hate. And I think it would benefit people to know that as far as like trying to fight this deck. And Thoughtseize is, it's definitely a card that is taking steps to solve a lot of those problems. Just give you a little bit more interaction with those things in game one, but it's also just doing the normal like Gerry thing of lowering the mana curve and putting some sideboard cards in the main deck so I can get some additional sideboard cards. So Bomat Courier definitely benefits from you having a lower curve because you're able to, get rid of your hand and then crack that thing for like 3 or 4 cards if you need to. And Midnight Reaper is kind of similar, where it's like if you are going to reload with this thing, you would want to be able to untap and play multiple spells, right? So, and Castle Locthwain is another thing. Just like this, everything the deck has going for it wants it to be able to have a cheap curve and play multiple spells per turn. And Thoughtseize is good, obviously. It doesn't seem like it should really matter in this sort of thing. Like you're trying to build a battlefield position, right? And do some stuff with it. But this kind of just like solves a lot of your problems.
No, I think this points to a really good adaptation in deck building as it relates to really linear approaches. So I remember back so this would be original Guilds of Ravnica. Wait, is it actually Guilds? GRN, yeah. So yeah. I build Junk Rights, which is a deck that has some similarities to this deck in that...
Guilds was most recent.
Okay, so what's the one before that? Return to Ravnica?
Yeah.
RTR. Okay, so I build Junk Rights. Junk Rights is another graveyard deck. It's designed to basically do one thing. It leads to an Angel of Serenity endgame. And when I first build the deck, every single card in the deck is only moving towards that plan. It's just creatures, mana. If you do that thing, it will be good enough. You will win. Weeks go on and people adapt to that. And they think about how they're going to interact with you. And so you can't just build in that linear fashion anymore, but your deck is so reliant on accomplishing these engines and these snowball states that you can't go too far away from those goals. So the way you adjust your opponent's plans in those situations is to find the most diverse option possible. In that format, I used Orzhov Charm, which is like medium card, doesn't do exactly what you want it to do, but it covered a little bit of everything. It answered opposing Deathrite Shamans, I have to remember the text on Orzhov Charm. Maybe it's that it rebuys your Deathrite Shamans from the graveyard and you were able to control the mirror that way.
So you return one casting cost creature, but it also kills a creature. It's like a vendetta.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So it could kill theirs and get yours back.
Exactly. And that became important as the weeks went on. And it just also became important to have like a spot removal spell. But you had to stay linear. You had to be able to accomplish your main goal. And I think that's exactly what you're doing here. You need something against cards like Yasharn that can be completely lights out. But you can't go as far as to play like Fatal Push and just end up with a dead card in your hand.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, even if Thoughtseize is like not hitting a Yasharn, it still does something else too. It's not like the Fatal Push problem, or if I played Heartless Act or something like that, where it's like it just sits there until my opponent plays a Yasharn. Well, if they don't have it, then I get to take their Extinction Event or Growth Spiral or whatever.
Yeah, and you maintain mana efficiency in that way. Like you're always spending your mana when you want to. You're not letting your opponent dictate to you.
Yeah, I will say that, like, Sultai or Four Color, whatever you want to call it, is the worst matchup for sure. Even with these little steps taken for Yasharn.
Yeah, look, I think these are the two best decks in the format in my eyes. The Sultai builds and this deck, and I'm okay with having to fight for it against them. And I've found success, especially in post-board games. And I think if you think about the matchup carefully there, you can get there. You're not a favorite, but I think you are approaching a fine matchup in post-board games. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that there are more steps that I could take to get it like closer to even, or maybe even become a slight favorite. So this is not the final form, almost certainly.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll dabble a little bit in that when we get to talking about the sideboard. I guess we've covered the majority of odd stuff here, but do you want to say anything about the core? And the core I would define as Priest of Forgotten Gods, Mayhem Devil, Cauldron Familiar, Witches of, and Claim the Firstborn. All of those are 4-ofs, and you have an article coming out on Star City.
It'll be up by the time this podcast comes out.
Right. We're recording this at 1:30 in the morning Pacific time on Thanksgiving Eve.
No, it's Black Friday now. It's not Thanksgiving anymore.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, as you know, I don't track days anymore, so good for you for keeping me on track. Time is weird, but there will be an article up shortly, and you made a really good point about Claim the Firstborn, where if that card is dead, it's time to put this deck away. Like, this deck needs to be able to leverage that card to be successful in the metagame. And the card is great right now. And if it wasn't, I don't think you could play Rakdos Sacrifice as an archetype.
Yeah, I think the sacrifice stuff is cool, right? Like Cauldron Familiar, Witch's Oven, Mayhem Devil, Priest. But if Claim is bad, that package starts to look much worse. And then it's just like, well, is all of that stuff better than playing like Knight of the Ebon Legion and Heart of Kirin or whatever? And I think the answer is no. So you really need all of those cards to actually be relevant. And I think, with Mono Red, Gruul, Auras, those sort of things like littering the format, taking up a decent chunk of the metagame, really, that the package is worth playing. And also all those cards are really good in the mirror match. So we're still in a spot where all of those cards are good, even if there are some matchups, even big ones like Sultai, where Claim is just not very good.
Yeah, and you fix that in post-board games and you live with it, but I think you're spot on. Make a metagame read. If there's a reason to play this deck, it's because you can succeed with Claim.
Yeah. The mana base is kind of cool. There's 24 lands, which might seem pretty high for a deck with a relatively low curve, but like we keep saying, we have a lot of ways to use our mana, and the mana base even contributes to that with Castle Locthwain, which is awesome in this deck. So I want to play a land every turn, especially with Bomat Courier. Like 18 to 22 land mono red decks with Bomat Courier, I'm not super interested in, because there are just times where you're like stuck on 2, Bomat up 4 cards, and you like can't really do anything. I would much rather Bomat and then just be able to untap and like play all my cards again, right? Like that's what makes the card good. And then obviously you want a bunch of lands for Castle Locthwain. Like you basically want to get Hellbent a lot of the time so that you can take advantage of all these different card advantage engines. And you do that by being able to play out your lands.
Do you look at Castle Locthwain as competing for the same spaces as the DFCs, things like Agadeem's Awakening or Shatterskull Summoning? I think Agadeem's Awakening would be the clear winner here if you were to play one of those two cards. But is it Locthwain or those, or do you just see them as different purposes?
To some degree. So like the deck has 3 Dragonskull Summits, which is kind of consensus at this point, and I agree with that. And a lot of it is because you're base black, right? So if you lead on Swamp versus turn 1 Dragonskull Summit, you're still going to be like pretty well off in a lot of games, even if you don't have red mana right away. So I think that in order to minimize the impact of things like Dragonskull Summit and Locthwain ETBing tapped, you just kind of like move away from those total. And obviously Agadeem's Awakening can make it so those cards are pretty awkward too. But I looked at all these lists and I was like, what? No Agadeem's Awakening? Like, you got to be kidding me, right? And I was like furious. And then I played with it and I was like, oh, this is like just not even that good, because it's only useful in certain spots. And that's like game one when they don't have Graveyard Hate. And it has to be a matchup where they're killing all your stuff and you have to draw it at the right time and blah, blah, blah. So shortly I was just like, yeah, I guess like Basic Swamp is probably better. I mean, for decks in Standard that are lower power level, they can usually use a reload because you don't have a ton of them. And this deck just has a ton of them.
I think that's a fair point. And I had similar experiences where I expected the card, because I think early list I was playing did have copies of Agadeem's Awakening, and I kept expecting it to be like, sweet, free roll, 3 creatures in play. It just doesn't work that way. Like you use your creatures as fodder for other stuff, especially once you get away from Stitcher's Supplier. It's really hard to play Agadeem's Awakening here and actually benefit from it and not just hit yourself for 3 on crucial turns over and over. So I agree with the decision. As high as I am on that card, it just doesn't quite fit here.
Yeah, and I mean, to answer your original question, I guess, like, yeah, there is some consideration to like Castle and Summit and things like that. You can't go overboard. But I do think that if you wanted to play like a copy, you could add one as a 25th land, and I'd be more than fine with that. And then, you still have the same amount of things to make your lands ETB untapped, which would be fine. I just, played with it as that slot, and it's like, well, I'm really not using this for anything, and it's just like killing me as a land, and I have better things to spend my life on with like Midnight Reaper, Thoughtseize, etc. So I was just like, yeah, I'll just cut this thing and like, maybe get an extra Thoughtseize in here or something that actually does something. And there were a few lists I saw that had like Call of the Death Dweller too. And I had a lot of similar issues with that card, where it's just like basically against everyone, you have to sideboard it out,
Yeah, I'll also say this, and I'm an Agadeem's Awakening fan. If I got to the place where I wanted a 25th land in this deck, I would almost certainly play 3rd Castle Locthwain before I would think about Agadeem's. Like, Castle Locthwain is just so important to your game plan and how the games play out. Its relative impact on the game state is likely to be much greater than just finding the random one Agadeem's Awakening. So weird for me to be bashing that card, but Locthwain is the truth in this deck.
Yeah, I don't want to bash the card because I think the card in a vacuum is quite good, right? Mm-hmm. But it's just like the way this deck plays out, everything else that's going on. Context matters, right? And
of course,
for as big of fans as we are of Agadeem's Awakening, I think we're equal or greater fans of Castle Locthwain, and everything that makes that card good is still true here. So,
my number 1 cards in Throne of Eldraine, which has proven to be absolutely 100% correct as time has gone on.
Well, after everything got banned,
yeah. Now that everything's banned, it looks brilliant.
I mean, like there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's like if there's a black deck, Castle Locthwain is at least in consideration for it being in there, right? So like the castles are definitely widely played, especially Castle Vantress for some ungodly reason.
Jerry's favorite castle.
Yeah, my least best card in Eldraine, Castle Vantress.
Wow, what a knock.
Well, is it like there's some much worse card in Eldraine?
Yes,
I feel like
there's definitely worse cards in Eldraine.
Nah. Sideboard talk. I have some Shatters. Shatters are pretty good. We just got Kaladesh. There's Witch's Oven in the mirror match. There's people who are going to try and Grafdigger's Cage you, occasional Heart of Kirans, Torrential Gearhulks. There's a Karn colorless ramp deck that tries to copy a bunch of Power Stone shards. Like, having some amount of Shatters is good. I mixed it up with 2 Abrade and 1 Bedevil, basically because Bedevil is a thing that you can like bring in against blue-white. It kills Cage, but isn't dead if they don't have Cage, because you can go after Teferi or Shark Typhoon or whatever. And then you also get another terror kind of thing that you can bring in against Yasharn. So it's a little clunky, but I mean, you and I have been doing this for a while where, you don't necessarily just max on Abrades.
Yeah, I actually would go further than you did with your deck. I would go 2 Bedevil, 1 Abrade. I had a bunch of situations where I feel very comfortable bringing in Bedevil in the dark. I will find something to do with it. I'm not going to get stuck. I did get stuck with some Abrades. And for me, this would change depending on whether I was playing a tournament with open deck lists or whether I was just on ladder. On ladder, I'm more comfortable having 2 Bedevil, 1 Abrade, because I just don't want to get stuck with a dead card. We talked about how important it is to be able to move forward with your game plan and not be reacting to your opponents and sitting there with cards in hand. And especially with Bomat Courier, where you're just like really incentivized to use things as you find them. I'm a little bit higher on Bedevil, but I understand mana efficiency matters in this deck too. So
yeah, I was going to say the Bomat thing cuts both ways, right? Where if you're stuck with a bunch of 3 mana cards in hand, then the Bomat's not necessarily going to do anything either. And then there's the consideration of, well, this is the spot removal that I bring in against mono red, for example, and you can't have it all just be murders, right?
Yeah, then you get absolutely smushed for sure. So I haven't been playing against a bunch of mono red, so maybe that's coloring my approach to the format right now. Is I just haven't felt really aggressive stings, and when I am playing against aggressive decks, it tends to be Gruul right now, where I'm a little bit more comfortable with something like Bedevil, because you generally find spots where you can still trade up on mana if you're bedeviling.
Yeah, that's fair. All of this stuff should be in flux, right? Like if you are expecting a different metagame than us, or you're having like different problems than us, like by all means change things. This is very much still a work in progress, like any deck list should be. So,
right. I've never finished a deck list. You know, I've been playing the game for 24 years now, and I still haven't gotten to the end of any deck list ever.
You know, I've built a lot of decks for, you know, especially during preview season, right? Where a set is like mostly previewed, and I start building out like all these ideas, and I'll get to do like the Yo Man thing, right? Where he's actually doing like the 50 decks, but I just never finish them. It's like, all right, I have these cards, these ideas, and I kind of know what I want my game plan to be. And now it's time to like get it down to 60 or 80 in some cases. And I'm just like, nah, I'm just not going to do that. Like, cause it like, even if putting it out, I just feel bad, right? Because it's like it's not going to be correct, right?
It's not even close to finish.
Right. So I want to come up with a way where I'm like, here is an idea that I have, and y'all can build from that. And I would very much enjoy doing that. I would post like way more decks that way.
That's where I'm at now. And I understand that occasionally, if you don't understand, that's the way I approach deck building. You could get burned by it. I try and be very clear about it. But if you just get a deck list, no context, because someone else retweeted it, it can be kind of a painful experience where you're just like, well, this is garbage. Why am I playing this?
Yeah, Brian, I went 1-6 with your deck on ladder. It was unplayable.
Right. It certainly can happen. I understand. But I try and assume my audience is of the more informed group, and they almost always are. I think people appreciate the sketch work, and you should share more of your stuff in early stages.
Yeah, it's probably the folks that catch it on the retweet, right?
Yeah, they get it the worst.
Like, they copy it exactly, and they're just like, well, someone wouldn't tweet this unless they thought it was busted, right?
Surprise, I'll tweet anything.
Yep. After some shatters, we have some Noxious Grasps. Not a huge fan of this card, but it is a card that you can bring in against Sultai, kills Nissa, Uru, Yasharn, is fine against some of the aggro decks like Gruul. You can bring it in as a one-of against blue-white control, which I think is also fine. But if there was a better card for this slot, I would be all about it.
Yeah, it does what you need it to do. There's definitely some problems that you need this card to answer that your deck will routinely face. So I like the inclusion of it. I think it's not a card I've seen a lot of in the historic format, but you found a good home for it here. You definitely wish you could do something more, though, with the slot and something a little cleaner. It's not Ether Gust, where it just does everything you want it to do. It has some pretty big holes.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe if I cut one for like a Heartless Act, but then that means that you can't kill Nissa with it. But that would allow you to bring it in against aggro decks like Mono Red, which might make me feel a little bit better. But I don't know, man. You need a lot of ways to kill Yasharn, and this is one of the ways that I'm trying to do it. And then like mixing up the Abrade Bedevils, that's another one.
Yeah, Gerry, I think if you're going to make that change, specifically like Noxious Grasp to Heartless Act, I might just do Blood Chief's Thirst instead, where you have now the cheapest possible removal spell and still outs to things like Nissa and Yasharn.
Oh, it's so bad against Sultai, though, for 4 mana.
It is, but it's bad in the same way that like Bedevil is bad. It catches everything, and that's the situation you find yourself in. And if you need to hedge against both really fast, aggressive decks and still have more outs to Yasharn because you've given up some of your Noxious Grasp slots, I don't know. I would rather just cover all my bases.
Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, Chandra, Torch of Defiance. This is why I have 4 mountains in my main deck, and it's basically just to cast this card. And I think I will go up to a 3rd copy of this before I go down to like 1 or 0, because this is a card that fights Yasharn and is actually reasonable. The problem is that some Sultai lists will actually like come out swinging. They'll have like Shark Typhoons and will play pretty aggressively with their Nissas and stuff like that. And it's not like against Azorius or whatever, where you just get infinite time to sit behind a Planeswalker.
Yeah. Again, another jack of all trades, but against Azorius, this is a slam dunk. And I mean, that is a significant portion of the metagame. It's nice to have a really strong option there. I even had a turn 3 Chandra off my Phyrexian Tower one game.
Hell yeah.
That was an easy game. I ultimated Chandra, won very easily. But the card covers all your bases. Again, more Yasharn protection, like you mentioned. I've been super impressed with it. It's been my favorite sideboard card. I'm bringing it in a lot. I've even discussed Copy's main deck. And it's weird. Like, it's certainly far more vulnerable in game 1s than it is in games 2 and 3 when you can specifically tailor your strategy for it. And also you're making a metagame call when you choose to play this deck, as we discussed. So if you're a Claim the Firstborn deck, it's hard to be like, oh yeah, I'm a 4 Claim the Firstborn deck, but I also main deck Chandra because I anticipate playing these matchups a bunch.
Right.
It's like, well, why are you here then? So
yeah,
it's a question you have to answer. I do think that Chandra is diverse enough that you can get away with that to a small extent. Like 1 copy main makes some degree of sense to me because it is reach and you can use it in that fashion. And it's not the most efficient piece of reach, but it will occasionally do the job for you. So been impressed with this card 100%. 3 in the sideboard makes sense. 2 in the sideboard, 1 in the main deck is something I do want to try.
Yeah, I'd be fine with that too. I think, like you said, 1 copy doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it's like, compare Chandra to Midnight Reaper. Like they're kind of accomplishing similar things. And I would prefer to have like the cheaper card in a lot of instances, but right now the main deck can't kill a resolved Yasharn, which is obviously a huge problem, especially like the more copies that people put in their main decks. And that is probably going to be a thing that we need to solve sooner rather than later.
I think so. If you looked at the results from this past weekend, it seemed like Sultai was played at a much larger clip than the 4 color list. Now, part of that could just be like mislabeling of decks, which I don't think the metagame percentages get curated any more than what you label your deck as. So if someone included Yasharn and called the deck Sultai, I think it would just be lumped under Sultai.
Yeah.
I might be wrong about that. I'm not 100%. But if that is the case, then it's not a clear reflection. But regardless of what happened last week, I think going forward, I would expect to see more 4 color, less Sultai.
Yeah, I would too. I'm scared of Yasharn. I think that Sultai without splashing is a good deck, but I think that they pick up a ton of percentage points in any given tournament just by, adding the pig to your deck for very little cost.
Yeah, and the win rates reflected that. Again, assuming they are accurate, then they reflected that. But the Sultai deck's pretty mediocre performance, if I recall correctly, like somewhere 45, 46%. But the 4 color control deck's closer to 60%. So,
yep. 2 Thoughtseize in the sideboard. I think that makes a decent amount of sense. Like I have 2 main deck. There are a lot of decks where I would want to go up to 4 copies. They don't necessarily need to be all Thoughtseizes. Like, I think if you were concerned about control decks, you could make the case for like a Duress and 3 Thoughtseize or something. But Yasharn is such a big issue that I'm just maxing on this card because it handles all the problems.
Yeah, I don't have a long list of decks that I feel like I would benefit all that much from having Duress as opposed to Thoughtseize. So I just like 4 Thoughtseizes. Seems like the safe play now.
Well, Duress is like a card that you could have against something like Mono Red. And
sure.
Just
but like, do you need to?
No, probably not.
Yeah, I don't know that you benefit all that much, especially the way like Mono Red is presently built. It doesn't seem like that big of a get to have access to Duress.
I will say that right now, me overcompensating for a few things leads to having some weaker sideboard plans against mono red type of stuff. But I also don't think that I need to change anything.
Yeah, they need to show me something first before I'm accounting for mono red, because they just have a nightmare of a time with the Uro decks right now. And I think Uro's doing an effective job squeezing mono red out of the format to some extent. The win rates were horrible for mono red, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, when Kaladesh came out, a lot of my lists, or a lot of my sideboards rather, started with Chandra's defeat because I assumed that mono red, especially with Chandra, would be a thing. And it's like, okay, yeah, I just haven't played against anyone who's doing that or haven't seen that deck win at all. So,
yep.
Then the rest of my sideboard is Soul Guide Lantern and Witch's Vengeance, which could literally be anything. I think that Goblins ticking back up a little bit means that Witch's Vengeance should be in the sideboard, but also I haven't really needed it against them. So it makes it so you can almost certainly just hammer them, which is good, but you might not need to.
Yeah, make a read depending on metagame percentages. For a period last week, it looked like Goblins was headed towards a huge breakout. It had one day in like the SCG prelims where it had a absurd win rate, like 80%. Or something completely unprecedented. And then as the field, went through the cycles and accounted for the deck, it fell back to earth, which I think will mostly be the case with Goblins. Like how accounted for it is going to always determine its win percentages. And I think by the time the finals came, people were appropriately prepared. I would still lean towards preparing for the deck for the time being. And I would keep the 3 Witch's Vengeance for now.
Yeah, I really do look forward to the point where I can cut them, though, because then it's like, I have a better plan against Gruul or like maybe another card for Sultai or something. And I feel like a lot of my sideboard plans will just be like solidified at that point. I'll be very happy with them.
Yeah. Have you found any other matchups where you've brought in a Witch's Vengeance?
I mean, I see people like bring them in against like the Wizards mono red or whatever, and they always just look bad. So yeah. I don't know. I think I would just save them for elves and goblins, and that's it.
Okay.
And the Soul Guide Lantern I have is kind of like a nod to the mirror, even though it's like not great, especially against this version of the mirror. Like if you can somehow snipe a Cauldron Familiar or like maybe a Scrapheap Scrounger or something, you might feel pretty good. And then if they're doing Stitcher Supplier stuff, yeah, maybe you get to exile 10 cards and take away all their escape stuff or whatever, but it's not ideal. It was mainly just a card that I wanted as kind of a free answer to Uro against Sultai, just not get pressured by that thing.
Why Soul Guide Lantern over, say, Cling to Dust?
Because if you cling an Uro, it just sucks.
Okay, fair enough.
Like you just gain 3 life and then the card sits there, right? Whereas this, you get to eat it and then either eat another one or cycle it, which is much better than having to pay 4 mana to cycle it.
My shortcut has always been like Soul Guide Lantern if I'm a Lurrus deck, Cling everywhere else. But I see your point when it comes to Cling, and also like getting away from Stitcher Supplier and stuff, and already competing for some of that escape real estate with Woe Strider. I don't know that you'll be able to really fuel Cling effectively in this deck. I think it kind of fights against you. So I'm cool with Soul Guide Lantern here.
Maybe is like Scrabbling Claws is legal? I feel like people were talking about that at some point. I guess I didn't really look into that.
That sounds correct to me. Is Scrabbling Claws, what's the text on that? Is that just better than Soul Guide Lantern?
I mean, it's not better because so like you tap to exile a card. Or they choose a card and exile it, and then you can pay 1, sack it, exile target card, draw a card. So it costs 2 mana to like get the Uro up front, but I guess you can like, go after their graveyard to prevent them from escaping Uro if it's early. Yeah. So this is the type of thing that is like almost certainly worse against like stocked graveyards, but it's good against lighter graveyards. So.
Yeah.
For what I'm trying to accomplish with this slot, I've been pleased with Soul Guide Lantern, but it's also more of like a luxury thing. There's also things like God Pharaoh's Gift, where it's like, yeah, maybe I just want to go after their entire graveyard versus doing like the Scrabbling Claws thing. So I still think this is better.
Okay.
But yeah, another card where it's like, maybe there's something that's a little bit better in slot, and if I just have like a bunch of spot removal type of things, then maybe I don't need to like graveyard hate their Uro or whatever. And it's kind of similar in the mirror match too, honestly. As long as you kill Mayhem Devil and Priest, you're usually like pretty well off. So that might be fine. I don't know. I feel like I did a lot of decent work on the sideboard and I solved a lot of problems, but they're in like kind of ham-fisted ways. You know what I mean?
I didn't get that impression playing with the deck or even looking at the deck. I think that you've found solid plans. And why do you define them as ham-fisted? I'll put you on the spot. Like, is it just too on the nose? Like, here's my creature hate card, here's my graveyard hate card, and a little bit less
it's like
holistic planning?
Yeah, it's like, here's my goblins card, here's my God Pharaoh's gift card, here's my Sultai stuff, here's my stuff for Heart of Kirin. And then you look at the sideboard plans, and like there are things like Thoughtseize, right, where it's like it goes in a bunch of different spots, and like that feels nice. And then there are things like mono red, where I'm just like, I guess I bring in Chandra because my main deck cards are worse or whatever. That's why it feels bad to me.
I think that might be more about Historic than anything you've done here, because Historic has some very powerful outliers that they really, really require you to warp your deck. And it's almost like old Dredgeless, where it's like, okay, you get a portion of my sideboard, and if I don't, I'm just scooping to you. So take it, enjoy.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I feel too. I don't necessarily begrudge myself, like I'm putting this out there, right? I'm doing an article and a podcast about this because I believe in it. And I just look at this and I'm like, history has taught me that whenever I have a sideboard that looks like this, I can do better. And historically, I have been able to do better. Now, this might be a format where maybe that's just not possible, and it would be a first, but like Magic is full of firsts. So I won't be completely surprised. Like I did my due diligence. I did the best I could. This is what I came up with. Like you said, the plans work or whatever. It just doesn't feel like this is the final form, the optimal form.
Well, I mean, part of this process is turning it over to the hive mind, right? And sharing it with everyone and seeing what they come back with. So I am interested to see how that, if people take your word, which they should. I also believe in this deck. And, you and I, we like a lot of decks, but it's rare that we both are saying, yes, this is the deck we endorse. This is the deck we would play. But if I had a Historic tournament this weekend, something very close to the 75 cards would be what I was playing.
Yeah, I would almost certainly register like 70 of these cards, if not the entire 75. So I'm very confident in this. I mean, normally with standard, like especially the standard format post bans, it's like you could make a case on any given week for like Dimir or Urian or Gruul or whatever. And this, I'm just like, it's pretty cut and dry to me, honestly.
I agree with you.
Playing like a lot of the best cards have a low mana curve, a lot of good interaction, a lot of ways to draw cards. You use your mana every turn. Like what more do you want from a deck,
A Tiny Bones.
Oh, get out of here.
That's it. If I had a Tiny Bones, then I would finally be happy if I just had one Tiny Bones.
I mean, there's the running joke, right? Is just like ban everything until Tiny Bones is good.
Until Tiny Bones is good? Yeah, I like that approach to the format.
And I don't know. I mean, we might get to that point. Who knows?
Your day is coming, Tiny Bones.
I guess one thing that maybe we should have talked about earlier is like Collected Company in this deck, because that was a thing that people were doing, right? And I just mostly ignored it, and I didn't know how you felt about that. I mean, I know how you feel about Collected Company, period. But
I can't put Collected Company in this deck. There's no way. There's not enough creatures for me. It would not work. I certainly played those Jund lists with Collected Company. They never felt good to me. They didn't really feel all that close to me. More traditional builds of like Rakdos Sacrifice have always had my favor over things like the Collected Company Jund lists. So I don't really have a lot of good things to say about them.
Well, it's funny, right? Like Collected Company looks so splashy. It's like, oh, you hit 2 Mayhem Devils and killed your opponent or whatever. And then there are obviously other times that you miss, but realistically, just having Castle and Bomat and Midnight Reaper, you have these smaller ball ways of gaining card advantage. And that means that like your mana is good and you don't have these clunky 4-drops, and it just ends up being better across the board. Yeah.
So there's like some versions that were trying to be more combo-ish that I bought into the idea of being a Collected Company deck with things that were more focused around Bolas' Citadel. Maybe there's a place for that. But in terms of just like playing fair, I don't get it. Like this deck just does everything at a cheaper mana cost, and that is the appeal of this deck to me. And having this 4 mana card, which a lot of the versions that did play Collected Company were not 24 land decks like yours is. They were 22 land decks.
Yeah,
and
you had to be, because you had to play Oven and Company and Claim.
Yep.
And you end up with like 26 hits or whatever.
Yeah, I just don't buy it. I think this is a way better deck, way more consistent, and the power boost from Collected Company just isn't there. It's not that swingy of a card in this deck. You know, Collected Company has always felt best to me when it is putting almost combo pieces onto the battlefield and like lords that scale across multiple things. So in Spirits, those were some of the best Collected Companies I ever cast, where I got 2 lords into play, and their effect expands beyond their self-contained bodies. And I don't think Rakdos Sacrifice does that, with the exception of Mayhem Devil, really. Because like Priest of the Forgotten Gods needs to stick around for a turn, and the rest of the stuff here is just mostly bodies. And even Mayhem Devil, like if I'm blank and I cast Collected Company and I hit 2 3-drops, Midnight Reaper, Mayhem Devil. Wait, I didn't actually do anything. Like that should be my slam dunk. I hit the 2 best cards in my deck, and you don't actually accomplish anything. Whereas if I hit, Spirit Lord, I have an immediate flying clock. So I don't know. Something about the card does not track in this archetype to me. I've never wanted this to be a Collected Company deck, so I don't fault you at all for excluding it here.
One of the things I talk about in my article is that there are some sacrifice decks that I think are more in line with how people view the sacrifice decks, where it's like they go super wide and then, they sacrifice their entire board to Woe Strider, and the opponent or dies in like some flashy fashion or whatever, right? And this is not that deck. Like, right. You play out a few things and then you sack them for value, and then you play out more things, and you just keep doing that until your opponent dies, right? And I think Collected Company in like the rally decks, where you're like, I need this huge mass of things.
Yep.
Like that makes more sense to me. But in this sort of deck, I would much rather cast, like 3-drop into 3-drop, or 3-drop into 2 2-drops or something, and not rely on Collected Company trying to hit. And also, the spells are good, and you need the spells to interact, right? And Collected Company just does like more of the same and makes it so you can't play those spells.
The more you approach this deck as trying to instill upon your opponent death by 1,000 cuts, I think the better off you will be. The more you're just trying to maximize every little chip shot and every little advantage, and know you're going to have to work for your wins, but there's almost always a path to get there. You'll play games better and better, and you'll understand exactly what you're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, I think that this understanding came from Emma, basically, at least like on my side of things. And I know that, we shout out Emma a lot, but she crushes it. So
she's good at what she does.
Yeah. So she was the first one who was like, this is like a beatdown deck first, right? And then you have kind of like this combo-y finish. So she's trying to aggro people first and then do the sacrifice stuff later. And especially with Scrapheap and Bomat, I really tried to lean into that with this version.
Yep. Yeah, and it feels that way too.
Yeah. And then the Company ones are like, I'm never going to attack you, and then I'm just going to deal you 20 damage. And it's like, that doesn't work. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, it was more plausible at other points in the format, but it's not what I want to do now.
Yeah. What about Bolas' Citadel? Because that was a card that showed up in some of the sideboards too. And I think it's mostly nonsense, at least in this version.
I think you have to build towards it very specifically. I am interested in the idea of like some more Phyrexian Towers and maybe some more Chandras as a way to get there a little bit more quickly.
Dude, you're just chasing the high of that turn 3 Chandra, aren't you?
I really am. It was quite the experience. But no, I mean, there's something to be said about a deck which accelerates to that point. I just think it's a completely different deck. It's not doing any of the same things. It's not Scrapheap Scrounger beatdown. It's like Llanowar Visionary stuff. And it really doesn't belong in this conversation. I'm not saying it's impossible or it's not good. It's just different. It's not trying to do the same things.
I could see a version that is maybe more Citrus Supplier, less Bomat, and Like, yeah, maybe you just like max on Chandra and like that is your kind of like engine and partly removal card and stuff like that. I don't know. That's interesting.
What's it going to do better than this version is the question we have to ask. And what it's not going to do better, I can just tell you, is play against Grafdigger's Cage. And I think that's a huge portion of the appeal of what you've done here is that you've found really good strategies against Grafdigger's Cage.
If you're doing like Tower into Chandra and that's a big part of your plan, then I think that's pretty good against Cage, you know?
What's the surrounding part though? Like if your deck is built to get to Bolas's Citadel, then I assume.
No, I was not going to do Citadel. I was just going to cap Chandra.
Okay. So yeah, we're kind of mushing ideas together here, but that's a good illustration of how many different things there are to do with this kind of shell. You can go in a lot of different paths.
Yeah, I think it's weird. I think Chandra would solve some problems and also like cause a lot of problems too. But
I can tell what's happening is that we're again getting to that part in the show where we want to go build some decks.
Yeah,
which seems to happen every single week.
Yeah, no, that's true. I don't know. I feel like we covered a lot of stuff.
I think so, and I hope we have sold people on this deck, and I hope people are able to accomplish some goals. I don't know if there's any actual real big historic tournament this weekend, but maybe you're trying to get your ladder position shored up as we get to the end of this season, and maybe this is the deck to do it for you.
Oh, the PT's coming up too.
PT soon, yeah. Although do they have to submit soon? I saw Cedric saying he's decided on his deck, but that doesn't actually mean submission is any time soon. He's just made up his mind.
He sent me. I'm definitely going to play deck and text like every day this week. So
okay, good.
With a different deck. So
sounds good.
I'm sure that with the time that he composed the tweet, he thought that he had solidified his deck choice,
and nothing could change that opinion.
Yeah.
So this is the point in our show where we usually head over to our Discord and get some questions from our patrons over there. I did things a little bit differently this week, though. As I mentioned, it is Thanksgiving here in the States today, and I was in a thankful mood. I always like to dip into our Discord and just occasionally say thank you to everyone there for supporting us and helping us do what we do here on the podcast. And I also asked them this week if they would do the same and tell me something they were thankful for. And I'm just going to grab a couple here. There's a lot of really, really nice sentiments. If you're in our Discord, I advise you to go take a peek. Just add a little positivity to your life. I know we all need that right now. First one comes from Thiz Vandermeer. Thiz says, I'm thankful for my 3 cats keeping me sane while working from home for months on end. Gerry, do you relate to that?
Yes and no. I'm definitely thankful for my cats, but I wouldn't say they keep me sane. Right. There's definitely
they seem to drive you insane sometimes.
Yeah, there are moments where they instill sanity, which sure I'm thankful for, but it's very rare that I'm able to sleep for more than 4 hours at a time. So,
Speaking of people who don't get to sleep for more than 4 hours at a time, we have a message from Juha Hakala, who says, I'm thankful that I've been able to work remotely the whole COVID time and see my baby girl growing. So that's awesome. Way to find the bright spot in what has been a very, very tough situation. A lot of people saying they're thankful for the community we put together. That's certainly not why I wanted to get what they were thankful for, but I just wanted to say I appreciate that. And I'm happy that you guys have found a home and you all have a place to talk about Magic and grow as players, because we see that happen on a week-to-week basis for sure.
Best possible happy accident from doing this podcast. Not close.
Yes, right there with you. Here's a really nice one from David Davila. Says, I'm thankful for my daughter. She has a rare health condition that really scared us this year. We were told by doctors she was going to pass away in front of us, but miraculously she did not. She's doing well today, and she celebrated her first Thanksgiving at home. That is awesome, David, and I'm so happy for you.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And let's go with one final message from our friends over in the Discord. This one comes from Kira Randall. Says, I'm thankful for animal companions. right there with you. A lot of animal love being shared on Thanksgiving. My dog ate so much food today. Kai was just having absolute feast. He finished a quiche and mashed potatoes. And what else did he eat? I mean, he kind of gets the shaft because we're vegetarians, right? And I bet a lot of other dogs are having turkey. We do go out of our way to get him meat for sure. But today we did not have any meat in the house. So I hope he still appreciated everything we prepared for him.
It sounds like it. I don't know if he's like, getting through the quiche, getting through the mashed potatoes, and he's just like, where is the meat at the end of this?
He likes vegetables, and I'm not saying that. Like I am a little skeptical. Obviously, I care a lot about animals and protecting animals and trying to reduce our impact as humans on animals. But like, I also think I can't make that decision for my animal. Like I'm not going to make my dog be a vegetarian. That doesn't make sense to me. I don't think they generally have the awareness to be able to make those types of calls. So I am very, very cognizant of making sure he still gets to appreciate meat from time to time. But he also just like, if I hand him some broccoli, he's pretty happy about it. Like he's willing to eat that. So
for a while I was just making these like Amy's broccoli cheddar bake things. Mm-hmm. And one of my cats, Ren, for whatever reason, like he's very food motivated, right? Like basically all cats are, but like he would just like get in my face and like stare at me. And I was like, okay, fine, dude. You want some broccoli? Here, have some broccoli. And he was like, this is so good. And I'm just like, broccoli. What? Like I expected you to be like, this is trash, and then just walk away, So for a while, I would have one of those, like, every other night when I wanted a snack or something, he would just be right there. He was just like broccoli cat.
The things that Kai loves and hates are so strange. And he's very food motivated now. He wasn't, though, most of his life. Only now that he's gotten old and fat like his owners, has he decided that he wants to partake in more foods. But still, even with that, like, he just arbitrarily chooses things he loves and things he hates. And you can never know until you just hand him the food and see what his reaction is going to be.
Dude, the thing that weirds me out is, for as much as biology impacts these animals, right? It's like, oh, there's a noise, like I better go hide, right? It's like they're just so focused on like protecting themselves, right? And then I'll drop like a thing of cheese from a tombstone, and then they all just immediately go for it and try and shove it down their mouths. And it's like, you're so focused on protecting yourself, but you'll just eat anything. It could be poison. What are you doing?
Right. No concept of poison whatsoever. Just willing to put all food in the mouth. And I mean, it extends to like gross things outside. And I don't know. Obviously, that's where humans and animals have a little bit of difference built into them, where they are mostly willing to eat anything.
Yeah. And that just blows my mind. It's like, where's your sense of self-preservation now, huh?
I guess like it's probably mathematically based in that your odds of survival are better if you just are willing to eat everything than if you're picky about what is safe to eat.
Probably. Or, I mean, I could see where it's like, well, in the cheese example or broccoli or whatever, it's like it doesn't smell like death to them. And maybe there are certain things that they know not to eat based on smell or whatever.
I don't know. Again, Kai is like usually pretty discerning about what he's going to eat, but he got into this thing this year where he was like licking slugs all the time. I'm like, what are you doing? Why are you doing? He wasn't even eating them. He was just like, go up to the slugs and lick them. And dogs are weird.
Well, I guess, be thankful that you're not surrounded by like poisonous frogs or whatever, because that could get him in trouble. So
I am thankful for that. I'm thankful he is doing well and is healthy. And I am thankful for you and all of our listeners as well. And I'm happy to say that today.
No, same. Yeah, I don't know. Holidays, I'm not a big fan of, but I'll certainly participate. And yeah, I'm definitely very happy with how all of this stuff has turned out, and certainly like my place in the Magic community and the trajectory that it's taken me on, and for everyone in the Discord and like a lot of the nice people that interact with me like on Twitter and at tournaments and stuff like that. Like I'm definitely very happy to be here. There were definitely times in my life where I'm just like, yeah, the first thing that comes along that is, somewhat productive or like feels productive or like pays my bills or whatever, like I'm just going to ditch Magic for. And that has not happened because I started to appreciate the things that Magic had to offer me that were not just like grinding tournaments and, all the stuff that kind of tends to make people miserable, right? So,
Right.
Yeah, I'm very happy with how things went and the way that I was able to like adapt to the situation, and certainly the people I've met and everything. Like at this point, all of my friends are through Magic, and I just wouldn't have it any other way.
Now that is game.
Good luck.